They threw me into the frozen dark at 13, a human sacrifice for my sister's crime. My name is Pia, and for 15 years I've been the ghost they tried to bury. But ghosts don't stay dead. They climb. You want a second chance? You want my mercy? Look me in the eye and remember what you told that shivering child before you locked the door. Learn how to survive. The memory of that porch light dying out still flickers in the back of my mind, a cold spark that ignites every time I look out from this glass cage of power. The dusk settled over Chicago like a heavy charcoal shroud, blurring the sharp edges of the skyscrapers into a jagged silhouette against the freezing sky. From the 50th floor of the Loop's most prestigious financial tower, the world below looked like an ant colony of flickering headlights and distant, silent struggles. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the heat from the vents humming a low, mechanical lullaby that failed to thaw the deep-seated chill in my marrow. In this room, surrounded by polished mahogany and the scent of expensive espresso, I was the architect of billion-dollar recoveries. To the men sitting at the massive table behind me, I was a force of nature. But to myself, I was still the girl who knew exactly how long it took for the blood to stop flowing to your fingertips when the temperature dropped below zero. I turned back to the boardroom, my heels clicking with a rhythmic military precision that commanded silence without a word. "The restructuring is finalized," I said, my voice steady, carrying that particular weight of authority that only comes from someone who has looked at rock bottom and refused to stay there. The executives, men 20 years my senior, nodded in a daze of relief. They saw a woman who moved with the grace of silk and the hardness of steel. They didn't see the jagged silver line of a scar hidden beneath my navy silk cuff, a permanent souvenir of a January night 15 years ago when the frost claimed more than just my skin. It was a reminder that character isn't built in the comfortable sunshine of life. It's forged in the absolute, unforgiving frost. As the meeting dispersed, a junior associate fumbled his folders, his face flushing deep red as papers scattered across the expensive carpet. He looked up at me, expecting the sharp tongue of a high-powered CFO. I paused, kneeling slightly to help him gather the sheets, my movements fluid and devoid of the arrogance that usually filled these halls. "Take a breath, Ethan," I said softly, handing him the last page. "True leadership isn't about pointing out the stumble. It's about ensuring the fall doesn't define the journey. Go home to your family." He stammered a thank you, his eyes wide. I watched him leave, wondering if he knew how lucky he was to have a home that actually wanted him back. I gathered my own coat, a heavy wool blend that cost more than my parents' first house, and stepped into the elevator. The descent was a silent, gut-dropping rush. When the doors slid open into the grand marble lobby, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The warm, controlled hum of the upper floors was replaced by the harsh, gray light of the Chicago winter bleeding in through the revolving doors. I saw them before I heard them. 3 figures were clustered near the security desk, a discordant blot of faded fabrics and frantic energy against the pristine lobby. My heart didn't skip a beat. It simply hardened into a cold, dense stone. Gwendolyn, Vaughn, and Indira. My mother, my father, and the sister who had once been my world. They looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown taller in the ways that mattered. They were arguing with a stone-faced security guard, their voices rising in that familiar pitch of unearned entitlement. Indira, draped in a cheap faux fur coat that screamed of desperate vanity, accidentally backed into me as I tried to pass. She spun around, her face twisting into a sneer before she even saw who I was. "Watch where you're going, you little assistant," she snapped, her voice like gravel. "Do you have any idea who we are? We're here to see the director. Get out of our way." I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on hers. She didn't recognize me. How could she? The Pia they knew was a ghost, a girl they had erased 15 years ago to save their own reputations. I looked past her to Gwendolyn, whose eyes were darting around the lobby, calculating the cost of the chandeliers rather than looking for the daughter she had thrown into the snow. It is a profound tragedy when people only value you for what you can provide, yet remain utterly blind to who you have become. I didn't feel the urge to scream or reveal myself. I felt only a vast, empty distance, like looking at a photograph of a stranger's life. My security detail moved forward to intercept them, their hands hovering near their belts. "Ma'am, should we have them removed?" the lead guard asked, his voice low and protective. I watched Vaughn, my father, shrivel slightly under the guard's gaze. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of cutting corners and finally running out of room. I raised my hand, a small gesture that stopped the guards in their tracks. I didn't do it out of a lingering sense of daughterly love. I did it because my dignity was not a commodity they could touch. Offer them a warm coffee, I told the guard, my voice a whisper of velvet and ice. It's a cold night in Chicago. No one deserves to freeze, regardless of their choices. I walked toward the mezzanine, my reflection in the dark glass looking back at me like a twin I had long since made peace with. I climbed the stairs and looked down at them from the shadows. They were ushered to a corner seating area, clutching their paper cups, still oblivious that the woman they just insulted was the only person on earth who could stop their foreclosure. I watched them whisper to each other, their faces etched with the bitterness of people who believed the world owed them everything and gave them nothing. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting people back into your sanctuary. It means realizing they no longer possess the power to live in your head. I knew their financial records by heart. Every delinquent payment, every failed investment, every lie they told the bank to keep their heads above water. They were here because they were drowning, and they had heard rumors of a director of restructuring who could perform miracles. They had no idea that the miracle they were seeking was the same child they had once traded for a clean slate. I felt a wave of pity for the poverty of their souls. It was much harder to fix a broken spirit than a broken bank account. They sat there, waiting for a savior they had already discarded. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my assistant, my gaze never leaving the three people huddled below. "Cancel my morning briefing for tomorrow," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet mezzanine. "I'll be taking the meeting with the Vaughn family at 10 o'clock, but don't bring them to the office. Have them wait in the back row of the conference hall." I paused, watching Gwendolyn adjust her scarf with a practiced fake cough. "Let them wait until the room is cold. They need to understand the price of a seat at my table before I offer them a place to sit." I turned away, the city lights reflecting in my eyes. My heart didn't race. It grew cold, finally matching the wind outside. The city lights of Chicago are a vast, glittering ocean outside my window, but they offer no warmth. I stood in the center of my darkened living room, the steam from my tea curling into the cold air like a ghost. My hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, possessed a faint, betraying tremor. It's funny how a single scent or a specific chill can collapse 15 years of progress in an instant. The wind rattled the heavy glass panes, and for a split second, the sound transformed. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy oak door of a suburban house in Portland, slamming shut with a finality that echoed through my entire life. I watched the snow fall over Lake Michigan, the white flakes drifting aimlessly, much like I did that night. Each flake felt like a pixel of a memory I had tried to delete. I remembered the kitchen light, a harsh yellow fluorescent hum that made everything look sickly. I was 13. I was standing by the refrigerator, watching my sister, Indira, stumble through the mudroom. She was hysterical. Her breath smelled of cheap beer and terror. Her hands were stained with something dark, and the family sedan was idling in the driveway with a crumpled hood and a shattered headlight. My mother, Gwendolyn, didn't reach for the phone to call an ambulance or the police. She reached for a damp towel to scrub the grime off Indira's face. My father, Vaughn, didn't ask if the person Indira hit was okay. He was already pacing the linoleum floor, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. They didn't see a daughter in trouble. They saw a threat to the pristine image they had cultivated. Then their eyes settled on me. It was a predatory look, a silent agreement reached in the span of a heartbeat. I was the quiet one, the one who didn't fit, the spare. Vaughn pushed a piece of notebook paper across the table toward me. His voice was a low, desperate hiss. "Pia, listen to me. Your sister has a future. She has the Ivy League. If this goes on her record, she's finished. But you're a child. The law in this country treats children like pillows. You'll get a slap on the wrist, maybe some community service. Save her, Pia. Be the good daughter for once." He wasn't asking. He was assigning me a role. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand. Even then, I didn't act out of fear. I acted out of a foolish, desperate hope that this sacrifice would finally make them love me. I signed my name to a lie, believing I was protecting my sanctuary. The moment the ink dried, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 40 degrees. Gwendolyn's face, which had been a mask of pleading maternal grief, suddenly hardened into cold, industrial iron. She didn't thank me. She didn't hug me. She looked at me with a sudden, visceral disgust, as if I were the one who had actually committed the crime. To them, a criminal daughter was a stain, regardless of the truth. They needed the sacrifice, but they hated the lamb for being slaughtered. I had become a liability that needed to be liquidated. I wasn't taken to a police station. I wasn't given a lawyer. Vaughn grabbed my shoulder, his grip like a vice, and dragged me toward the front porch. The winter air hit me like a physical blow. He threw my 2 black garbage bags into the snow and looked at me with eyes I no longer recognized. "We've already reported the car stolen," he said, his voice devoid of any human vibration. "The police have your confession. If you stay, you go to juvenile detention. If you run, you're just another missing runaway. You're a ghost now, Pia. Don't ever come back and haunt us." I stood on that porch, watching through the glass door as Gwendolyn meticulously wiped Indira's fingerprints off the steering wheel in the driveway. She never looked up. Not once. The porch light flickered and died, leaving me in a darkness so absolute I thought the world had ended. Some people don't want to solve a problem. They just want to bury the person who witnessed it. I sat on those garbage bags for 4 hours, waiting for the door to open, for the joke to end, for the love to return. It never did. That was the night I realized I hadn't lost a family. I had escaped a prison. I pulled myself back to the present, my fingers tightening around the leather-bound folder on my desk. Inside was the car accident file I had spent years and thousands of dollars to acquire. It was all there. The doctored police report, the coerced confession, the evidence that would strip the KOL crown right off Indira's head. I have the power to destroy the life they built on my ashes. In America, the law eventually catches up to the shadows, especially when the shadows have a paper trail. I could make one phone call and watch their world burn, but I hesitated. Not because I still loved them. That emotion had frozen and shattered a decade ago. I hesitated because I refused to let their cruelty dictate my character. I remembered Sterling telling me once, "Hate is a heavy bag that slows down the traveler. If you want to go far, you have to travel light." I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to be a mirror they were forced to look into every single day. I chose to hold on to my humanity, not for their sake, but for the 13-year-old girl who was still waiting on that porch. A sharp ping from my phone broke the silence. I looked down at the notification. It was my assistant, her message glowing in the dark room. "Pia, the Vaughn family is at the front desk again. They're hysterical. They say they're being harassed by aggressive debt collectors and that since you're their blood, you're legally responsible for their protection. They're demanding an emergency meeting." A cold, sharp smile touched my lips, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has already seen the end of the movie. I set my teacup down on the glass table with a sharp click. "Tell them I'll see them at the bridge tomorrow night," I typed in reply, the motion decisive and certain. "Tell them it's time they saw the ghost of their own making." I rose and went to the window one last time. The past is never buried forever. It just waits for the right moment to blossom. The next 24 hours would be the final test of everything Sterling had taught me. The elevator descended into the belly of Chicago, its silent hum a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my chest. I didn't head for the penthouse tonight. Instead, my driver navigated toward the concrete arteries of Lower Wacker Drive. The air down here is different, thick with the scent of damp stone, exhaust, and the heavy silence of a world the sun forgot. I stepped out of the car, my heels echoing against the pavement with a hollow, rhythmic beat that felt like a countdown. This was the threshold, the place where the successful woman I had become met the terrified child I used to be. I walked toward a specific pillar, the one where the shadows seemed deepest. My mind drifted back to 2011, back to the biting cold of my first night on these streets. I remembered sitting on my garbage bags, my breath hitching as a tall, imposing shadow loomed over me. I expected a threat. Instead, I found Sterling. He didn't offer the empty pity of a stranger. He offered a choice that would define the rest of my life. "The world has already decided you are nothing, little one," he had said, his voice a gravelly baritone that vibrated in the cold air. "Only you can decide if the world is right. Now stand up. We don't die on our first night." Sterling became my sanctuary in the ruins. A man with the calloused hands of a laborer but the vocabulary of a philosopher, he turned our corner of the underpass into a classroom. He taught me that true wealth isn't what sits in a vault, but what remains in your mind when everything else is stripped away. I thought of the countless times he skipped meals just to save enough change to buy me tattered textbooks from thrift stores. He saw something in me that Gwendolyn and Vaughn had willfully ignored. He taught me that kindness is a debt we don't pay back to the giver, but pass forward to the next person we find drowning. As the years passed, my survival became a transition into a weapon. Under Sterling's watchful eye, I worked 3 grueling jobs, coming back to our propane heater to audit my homework on global financial markets. He pushed me to understand the flow of capital as well as I understood the flow of the Chicago wind. I wasn't just learning to live, I was being sharpened. I remember him looking at my graduation papers from the night school, his eyes reflecting the small flame of our heater. "They discarded a girl," he whispered. "They have no idea they've created a storm." The memory faded as I reached my destination, a high-security safe deposit vault in a discreet corner of the city. The metallic clicks of the lock echoed in the small, sterile room, a cold sound that matched the temperature of my blood. I pulled out a rusted metal lighter and a thick stack of notarized documents Sterling had entrusted to me before he passed. My fingers traced the edges of the paper. I hadn't looked at these in a long time. I needed the final pieces of the puzzle before I faced the ghosts at the bridge. The documents were a ledger of a life destroyed. I began to read, and for a moment, the room felt like it was spinning. Sterling wasn't just a man who fell on hard times. He was Sterling Vance, a titan of the investment world who had been systematically framed and liquidated in a predatory pump-and-dump scheme 20 years ago. My eyes raced down the page, searching for the signature on the fraudulent contracts that had sent him to the streets. The name at the bottom hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Vaughn, my father. The shock was a visceral, sickening heat. Vaughn hadn't just discarded his own flesh and blood, he had destroyed the very man who would eventually save her. The irony was a jagged blade in my heart. Sterling hadn't found me by accident that night in 2011. He had been tracking Vaughn for decades, a silent ghost waiting for a weakness. He chose to save the daughter of his enemy, turning his thirst for revenge into a masterpiece of redemption. He didn't use me to hurt Vaughn. He raised me to be the living proof of Vaughn's failure. Sterling's voice returned to me then, clear as a bell in the silent vault. "Vaughn builds houses of cards, Pia. I am teaching you how to be the wind." I understood it now. My father's current bankruptcy wasn't just a streak of bad luck. It was a delayed reaction to the poison he had sowed into the soil 20 years ago. He had built his life on the ruins of better men, and now the foundation was finally giving way. The man I called father was a thief of lives, and the man I called Sterling was the guardian of the truth. I returned to the office, the Chicago lights smudging through the window, creating a menacing bokeh effect. I didn't sit down. I began pinning documents to the wall, creating a map of Vaughn's crimes. Under Illinois law, the evidence in my hands was a death sentence for his freedom. Cyber fraud, securities violations, and systemic embezzlement had ruined Sterling Vance. I had enough evidence to ensure Vaughn would never see the light of day outside the prison yard again. I felt the cold, predatory focus, the pent-up suffering of a decade finally unleashed. Yet, as I stared at the board, I remembered Sterling's last instructions. "Justice is a surgeon's blade, not a butcher's knife, Pia. Use it to heal the truth, not just to spill blood." I didn't want to become the monster I was fighting. I didn't want my victory to be stained by the same lack of humanity that defined Gwendolyn and Vaughn. I chose to give them one final chance to be human, even though every instinct told me they were incapable of it. True power isn't about the ability to crush, it's about the discipline to stay your hand. I dialed my assistant, my voice sounding like a gavel hitting a block. "The meeting at the bridge is confirmed for tomorrow evening," I said. "Prepare the standard non-disclosure and settlement drafts, but keep the criminal disclosure files in the red folder. They get to choose which one we sign." I looked at the rusted lighter on my desk, the only thing Sterling had left me besides his wisdom. It was a symbolic location, the place where Gwendolyn and Vaughn threw me away, and where Sterling Vance found me. I picked up the lighter and sparked it. The small orange flame reflected in the dark pupils of my eyes, a tiny beacon in the vast Chicago night. "You taught me how to survive the dark, Sterling," I whispered to the empty room. "Now, I'm going to show them exactly what lives in it." I watched the flame dance for a moment before snapping the lid shut. Tomorrow, the ghost they created would finally step into the light. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The transition from the cool, subterranean air of the vault to the bright, synthetic glare of my office was a jolt to my system. I stood motionless by the window, the morning sun over Chicago looking deceptive and thin. My fingers still felt the cold weight of Sterling's documents, but the digital world had already begun its assault. My phone, lying on the desk, was a vibrating hive of notifications. It wasn't just the firm anymore. It was the world. The digital guillotine dropped at 9 a.m. Sharp. Indira had taken my face, my name, and my carefully built career, and fed them into the insatiable engine of social media. Fueled by a jealousy that had fermented for 15 years, she had posted evidence of my homeless past, carefully edited photos and clips of me ignoring them in the lobby. She framed me as a degenerate runaway, a daughter who struck gold and left her loving, struggling parents to rot in a Portland gutter. The post was a viral wildfire. By noon, the public narrative was cemented. I was the cold-blooded executive leaving a dying mother in poverty. I watched the notifications scroll by, a dizzying montage of hate and moral outrage from strangers who couldn't find my office on a map. "Pia, the board is on line 1, my assistant whispered through the intercom, her voice trembling. The firm's directors weren't interested in the truth of 2011. They were interested in the stock price. They demanded my immediate resignation to save the firm's image. I sat in the center of my high-rise office, a static silhouette against the chaos. I didn't beg for my seat. I knew that public opinion is a mirror that often reflects the bias of the viewer, not the soul of the subject. My team urged me to issue a defensive PR statement, to fight fire with fire. I refused. Silence is a form of power that most people are too afraid to use. I knew that the truth doesn't need to shout to exist. It only needs to wait for the noise to die down. I watched my world burn on a 5-inch screen and simply waited for the next level of the family's desperation. It came sooner than I expected. At 3 p.m., a commotion erupted in the lobby 50 floors below. I watched the feed on my monitor. Gwendolyn was in a wheelchair, a pale headscarf covering her hair to imply a loss she didn't have. She was surrounded by local news crews, their flashbulbs hitting her sickly face like rhythmic lightning. She tearfully pleaded for me to come home before her time ran out. Indira stood behind her, dabbing at dry eyes, playing the role of the devoted sister to perfection. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. "I have stage 4 cancer," Gwendolyn announced to the microphones, her voice a fragile trill. "My only wish is for my prodigal daughter, Pia, to help pay for my life-saving treatment and forgive the past." It was a deathbed performance designed to socially execute me if I refused. The press was eating it up. In America, there is no villain more reviled than the ungrateful child of a dying mother. The legal trap was set. A refusal to help would be the end of my professional life. I watched her through the monitor, zooming in on the small orange bottle in her lap. I recognized the label. It wasn't chemotherapy. It was a high-dose iron and niacin supplement, the kind that causes temporary pale skin, nausea, and tremors if taken in excess. She was poisoning herself just enough to look the part. I felt a cold, deep-seated disgust. A mother's love is supposed to be the world's first sanctuary, but when it becomes a weapon, there is no place left to hide. I decided then to play along, to pull them so close to the trap that they could never get out. I tightened my coat and walked toward the elevator. The sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor mimicked a countdown. When the doors opened into the lobby, the crowd of reporters surged forward, then went absolutely silent. I walked directly to the wheelchair. I didn't hesitate. I knelt in front of Gwendolyn and took her hand. To the cameras, it looked like a daughter's broken-hearted reconciliation. To Gwendolyn, it was a terrifyingly cold touch. I leaned into the microphones, my voice clear and carrying a calculated grace. If my mother is truly ill, she deserves the best care money can buy. My penthouse has a full guest wing and 24-hour private staff. I am moving her, my father, and my sister into my home tonight. We will face this crisis as a family. The reporters scrambled to record the moment. I saw the flash of triumph in Indira's eyes and the greedy smirk Vaughn tried to hide. They thought they had won the jackpot. I knew that to catch a parasite, you must first give it a host. By bringing them into my home, I was putting them under 24/7 surveillance where they couldn't hide their health or their lies. They were no longer ghosts on the street. They were residents in my fortress. I leaned in closer to Gwendolyn, my lips brushing her ear so the cameras couldn't see. I hope you enjoy the view, Mother, I whispered, my voice a sliver of ice. It's a long, long way down from the 50th floor. Gwendolyn's terminal cough faltered for a second. Her eyes widened, the pupils dilating as she realized she hadn't just won a lifestyle. She had just entered a cage. The private elevator ascended in a silence so thick it felt pressurized. As the doors slid open into my foyer, the transition was jarring. Gwendolyn, Vaughn, and Indira stepped out, their presence instantly clashing with the minimalist sanctuary I had spent years building. I watched, detached, as their muddy shoes marred the pristine white Italian marble of my entryway. To them, this wasn't a home, it was a prize. They moved through the space with a frantic, uncoordinated energy, their eyes darting toward every piece of art and high-end fixture like vultures locating a fresh carcass. I felt a surge of profound disgust, yet I remained perfectly still, a silent observer in my own violated fortress. The heavy oak doors hadn't been closed for more than 10 seconds before Gwendolyn's terminal frailty evaporated. She stood up from the wheelchair with a nimble strength that would have shocked the reporters downstairs. Without a word of thanks, she began pacing the perimeter of the living room, flipping over small sculptures to check for artist signatures and price tags. Her eyes glowed with a predatory hunger that had absolutely nothing to do with her supposed stage 4 cancer. Looking back now, I should have seen that her illness was merely the latest costume in a lifetime of performances. I realized then that the only thing truly terminal about her was her greed. Indira didn't even wait for a tour. She headed straight for the guest wing, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood. Within minutes, she had found her way into my walk-in closet. I heard the frantic rustle of silk and the clatter of accessory drawers being pulled open. She emerged draped in a sapphire necklace I had purchased to celebrate my first million, clutching a $10,000 Hermes bag like it was a birthright. "You owe me this, Pia," she sneered, her voice dripping with a toxic mix of envy and entitlement. "I've been rotting in a dump in Portland while you've been playing queen in Chicago. It's only fair we balance the scales." I stood by the kitchen island, slowly pouring a glass of water, my movements measured and calm. I thought of a lesson Sterling taught me back under the bridge. Greed is a bottomless pit that eventually swallows the person digging it. He was right. Looking at them now, I didn't see a mother, a father, or a sister. I saw an industrial-sized debt, a trio of parasites who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. I didn't argue. I didn't demand my necklace back. I simply watched, documenting the violation of my sanctuary with the cold precision of a forensic accountant. As the evening wore on, the invasion turned from celebratory to malicious. I retreated to the kitchen, but I kept my eyes on the high-definition security monitors hidden behind the backsplash. I watched Vaughn creep into my home office, his silhouette hunched and desperate. He began rifling through my desk drawers, his fingers fumbling with my personal stationery and files. He wasn't looking for a family photo. He was looking for bank statements, passwords, or the keys to the safe he assumed was hidden behind the art. He muttered to himself about restitution for raising such a selfish, ungrateful child. It was a chilling display of the logic of the entitled. On another screen, I watched Indira sitting at my desk, her face illuminated by the blue light of my business laptop. She was trying to bypass the biometric lock, her tongue poking out in concentration as she attempted to guess my security questions. I knew exactly what she was after. She wasn't just looking for money, she was looking for proprietary trade secrets, the kind of data she could sell to my competitors to clear her own mounting debts. They weren't just guests in my home, they were saboteurs attempting to dismantle my entire life from the inside out. They had no idea that every keystroke was being logged and every movement recorded in a legal, domestic security installation. I felt a strange sense of stoic calm as I watched the betrayal unfold in real time. When you give a thief a key, you aren't being foolish. You are letting them choose the day of their own arrest. I knew that the Economic Espionage Act carried heavy federal penalties, and by bringing them into this controlled environment, I had effectively built a legal cage. I didn't rush in to stop Vaughn from breaking the lock on my filing cabinet. I didn't shout at Indira to get off my computer. I waited. I let them build the evidence that would eventually set me free from their shadow forever. By 8 o'clock, I had a lavish dinner prepared, a performance of my own. I called them to the table, and they emerged from their various raids looking flushed and triumphant. I treated them with a chillingly polite grace that seemed to unnerve Vaughn, though Gwendolyn was too busy resuming her theatrical coughing fits to notice. I offered her a special herbal tea, harmless but bitter, and watched her sip it while she complained about the draftiness of my 50-story penthouse. "We all pretend to be strong until the right pain finds us," she sighed, dabbing her eyes. I smiled, knowing her pain was entirely self-inflicted by the niacin she had taken earlier. The dinner was a surreal exercise in hypocrisy. Vaughn raised a crystal glass, the expensive wine catching the light of the Chicago skyline. "To family," he said, his voice booming with a false heartiness that made my skin crawl. "To second chances, and the blood that binds us." His eyes, however, never left the large oil painting on the far wall, the one he correctly guessed hid my wall safe. I raised my glass of water in response, my voice steady and low. "To the truth," I said, my gaze meeting his. "It's the only thing that remains standing when the lies finally burn down." I spent the entire afternoon on encrypted phone calls with my legal team. Every minute they spent in this apartment was a recorded step toward their own downfall. I was documenting Gwendolyn's physical agility, proving she wasn't terminally ill. I was documenting Vaughn's failed theft attempt and Indira's cyber espionage. Under U.S. law, I was building a case that would ensure no court in the country could award them a dime of my property. This was my plan, a slow, deliberate buildup of pressure that they couldn't yet feel. Despite the visceral disgust I felt, I ensured they were housed in absolute luxury. I showed Indira to a guest suite with a view that cost more than her Portland apartment. She was still wearing my sapphire necklace, preening in the mirror. "Beauty is skin deep, Indira," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "But character goes all the way to the bone. You can wear my diamonds for the night, but you'll never possess the light they reflect." She scoffed, turning her back on me, already lost in a fantasy of the wealth she thought she had stolen. I walked away without another word. As the penthouse finally fell into a restless quiet, I retreated to my office. I stood in the center of the room, looking at the messy drawers Vaughn had left behind and the smudges on my laptop screen. The violation felt heavy, a physical weight in my chest. I didn't panic. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a cold, sharp clarity that Sterling would have recognized. I picked up my phone and made a single, brief call to my lead counsel. "The bait is taken," I whispered into the receiver, my voice reflecting the steel of the skyline outside. "They've attempted to access the proprietary files and the safe. Everything is on the server. Prepare the final documents for the bridge meeting tomorrow. We're going to give them exactly what they asked for." I hung up and looked out at the sea of diamonds that was the Chicago night. That hit harder than silence ever could. I watched them destroy my home, only to realize they had already destroyed their place in my heart long ago. I didn't realize it then, but the next 12 hours would be the end of the Vaughn family legacy, and the true beginning of mine. The first light of a Chicago February morning is never warm. It is a pale, clinical gray that strips the glamour from the skyline. I sat at the head of my mahogany dining table, the steam from my coffee rising in a single, undisturbed line. The atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with a pressurized silence, the kind that precedes a devastating storm. Facing me were the three people who had spent the last 24 hours trying to dismantle my life from within. Gwendolyn, Vaughn, and Indira arrived at the table with arrogant, sweeping smiles, their posture radiating a premature triumph. They were convinced their invasion had reached its final stage, and that I was finally broken enough to pay for their permanent departure. I didn't reach for a checkbook. Instead, I slowly turned my laptop screen to face them. The high-definition footage from the hidden security sensors began to play, and the room went deathly still. The audio was crystal clear, capturing Gwendolyn's sharp, healthy laughter as she mocked her own terminal illness between sips of my expensive wine. Then came Vaughn's voice, cold and transactional. "We should have sold that brat for more than $500 back in Portland. She's turned into a golden goose we didn't cook soon enough." I watched their faces turn the color of wet ash as their own voices filled the room, stripping away every mask they had worn. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer them the satisfaction of my anger. I looked at them with a profound, quiet pity that seemed to unnerve them more than a scream ever could. The tongue has no bones, but it is strong enough to break a heart, or build a prison for the person who speaks. I let the recording play to the very end, allowing the silence that followed to weigh on them like lead. Despite the bile they had spewed on that tape, I offered them one final human moment to confess. "Truth is a heavy burden to carry, Gwendolyn," I said, my voice steady as stone. "But a lie is a debt that eventually bankrupts the soul. Tell me the truth about 2011, right now." Their response was not a confession, but a renewed, desperate venom. Gwendolyn's tremors vanished as she slammed her hand on the table, her face contorting into a mask of pure malice. Indira laughed, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the Hermes bag she still clutched. They threatened to release the viral video Indira had already queued up, the one that would frame my calculated cruelty to the world. They were doubling down on a house of cards that was already beginning to fold. I watched them, understanding that some people would rather drown in their own lies than reach for a hand that requires them to be honest. I let out a slow, theatrical sigh, acting as if their threats had finally found their mark. I slid a thick stack of asset transfer agreements across the table. "Fine," I said, my voice sounding hollow and defeated. "Sign these. You get the Chicago property, the Portland debts are cleared through my firm, and I've established an irrevocable trust fund for Indira. In exchange, you sign a permanent restraining order and disappear from my life." Their eyes lit up with a feverish, sickly greed. They didn't even reach for a pair of reading glasses. They saw the words trust fund and transfer of ownership and began signing every page with a frantic, scratching haste. It was a legal masterpiece. Under Illinois law, these documents were structured as settlement and voluntary disclosure agreements. By signing them in their haste to claim my assets, they had legally admitted to the 2011 car accident fraud, the Sin Eater plot, and Vaughn's original embezzlement against Sterling Vance. The documents included a waiver of immunity, meaning their signatures functioned as sworn affidavits that could be used in criminal proceedings. They were so busy looking at the price tag that they didn't notice the contract was for their own accountability. I had a notary public standing by whom they had dismissed as mere staff to witness the finality of their ruin. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the icy Chicago River. Behind me, the family was still whispering in celebratory tones, oblivious to the fact that I was already completing the digital filing on my tablet. "The documents have been electronically submitted to the Cook County State's Attorney and the SEC," I said, not turning around. The room went silent again, but this time it was the silence of a vacuum. I explained that the asset transfer was legally contingent upon the truth of the declarations. Since their declarations were admissions of federal and state crimes, the assets were automatically frozen and seized as court-ordered restitution for their victims. I turned back to look at them one last time. Indira was still clutching the stolen necklace, her face frozen in a mask of realization. I looked at her, the sister I had once tried to protect with my own future. "You once asked me why I didn't come back, Indira," I said softly. "I didn't come back because I was busy becoming the person who could finally forgive you without needing you." I instructed my security team to bring in the bags. They were the same black garbage bags from 15 years ago, the ones Vaughn had thrown into the Portland snow. The meeting at the bridge was still on. Not because I was going to give them a single cent, but because I was going to give them their freedom, the same terrifying, cold freedom they had given me. Vaughn's phone began to ring incessantly. It was the bank, and for the first time, it wasn't a call he could ignore. Gwendolyn's tremors returned, but this time they were real. The tremors of a woman who finally realized that the cage she had built for her daughter had become her own. I looked at the clock on the wall. "It's time to go," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a gavel. The wind is picking up, and you have a lesson to finish. The limousine glided through the charcoal veins of Chicago, the city's skyline bleeding into a bruised purple sunset. As we approached the iron labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive, the air grew thick with the familiar scent of damp concrete and diesel. I stepped out of the car, my heels striking the pavement with a hollow, solemn beat. The wind howled through the underpass, carrying the same icy, unforgiving bite it had on that January night in 2011. I watched Gwendolyn, Vaughn, and Indira emerge from the vehicle, their faces pale and confused. They were still clutching the contracts from the morning, their eyes darting between the dark, damp pillars with a growing, frantic dread. They expected a payoff in the shadows. They didn't realize they were standing at the site of my first death. I walked toward the exact spot where I had once huddled on those black garbage bags. The rusted metal beams above us groaned in the wind, but I no longer saw them as bars of a cage. I saw them as the iron foundation of my rebirth. I turned to face them, my silhouette sharp against the distant city lights. "You didn't just throw me away here," I said, my voice barely a whisper yet cutting through the gale like a blade. "You threw away the only person who would have ever loved you for free." I looked at Gwendolyn, whose fake cough had finally been replaced by the genuine tremors of terror. I realized that the greatest poverty is not a lack of money, but a lack of love so profound that you see your own child as an obstacle to your comfort. I felt no heat of anger, only the cold, heavy weight of a concluded lesson. The atmosphere shifted as the low, rhythmic throb of distant sirens began to rise, harmonizing with the howling wind. Blue and red lights began to dance against the concrete pillars, reflecting off the dark river water nearby. Vaughn dropped to his knees, his voice cracking as he began to plead for mercy, citing family blood and second chances. Gwendolyn tried to reach for my hand, her face a mask of manufactured maternal grief, unaware that the high-definition recording of her mockery was already in the hands of the detectives waiting in the shadows. They weren't here for a payout. I was handing them back to the reality they had spent 15 years trying to outrun. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Sterling's rusted lighter. The metal was cold and pitted, a relic of a man who gave me everything when he had nothing. I didn't offer them my bank accounts or the keys to the penthouse they had just violated. I took Gwendolyn's hand and placed the small, heavy object into her palm. The orange flicker of the lighter's flame had once been my only beacon. Now, it was the only inheritance I had for her. I looked her directly in the eye, the reflection of the police lights flickering in my pupils. 15 years ago, you told me I was no longer your daughter, I said, my voice carrying a terrifyingly gentle grace. You told me to learn how to survive. Today, I am simply returning your own wisdom to you. Learn how to survive, mother. The sound of the handcuffs clicking onto Vaughn and Gwendolyn's wrists was a sharp, clinical punctuation to my childhood. As the detectives led them toward the cruisers, Vaughn looked back, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic shock. I stood tall, the wind whipping my coat around my legs like a dark shroud. Character is what you are in the dark when you think no one is watching. They were watched, they were weighed, and they were found wanting by the very law they tried to subvert. The sin-eater was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that true justice isn't about the size of the blow, but the weight of the truth. I turned away from the sirens and the shadows, walking toward the shoreline where the city met the vast, open horizon of Lake Michigan. The camera of my mind panned out, leaving the grimy underground behind for the silver serenity of the water. I watched from a distance as Indira was escorted away, not to a cell, but to a mandatory rehabilitation program I had secretly funded. I didn't seek her destruction. I sought my own peace. And I have learned that peace is a wall the toxic can never climb. I pulled out a new, polished lighter and sparked a flame, looking at a small photo of Sterling Vance I kept in my wallet. He was no longer a ghost of ruin. He was a legacy of opportunity. I realized then that family isn't defined by who you were born with, but by who would die for you, and more importantly, who would live for you. Sterling had lived for me, and in doing so, he taught me that I was worthy of the sun. I turned my back on the bridge and the ghosts that lived beneath it. I was no longer the discarded daughter or the architect of billionaire debts. I was simply Pia. I walked into the light of the rising moon, my silhouette a testament to a resilience that could not be broken by blood or by ice. Sometimes, closure doesn't come from a conversation or an apology. It comes from the moment you decide you've had enough of their noise. I didn't win out of revenge. I won by choosing a peace they couldn't touch. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of a betrayal, know that your strength is your greatest inheritance. It is the one thing they can never take back. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you ever had to find your worth in the dark? Tell me your story below. I read every one.